In the depths of a frozen January night in 1347, while nobles slept beneath goose-down quilts and fur coverlets, a woman named Agnes wrapped her threadbare cloak tighter and hurried through knee-deep snow toward a hovel where a young mother's screams pierced the darkness. Good evening, dear listener. Let me take you back through the mists of time to a world so different from our own that it might seem like another planet entirely. Tonight, as you rest in warmth and comfort, I'll tell you the story of a woman whose courage and skill brought light into the darkest corners of medieval existence. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let yourself drift back 7 centuries to a time when winter meant something far more dangerous than we can easily imagine today. Agnes of Thornbury was 34 years old in that winter of 1347, though if you had seen her face in the dim light of a rush candle, you might have guessed she was closer to 50. Her hands told the truest story of her life. Broad, capable hands with fingers thickened at the joints from endless work in cold water, nails worn short and sometimes torn, palms crossed with old scars from kitchen knives and hot pots, and 100 other small disasters of daily life. But those hands were also surprisingly gentle, and they knew things that few others in her village understood. They knew the exact pressure needed to turn a baby in the womb, the precise angle to support a laboring woman's back, the careful touch required to clear a newborn's mouth and nose so that the first precious breath could come. She had not been born to this calling. Agnes had been born in the spring of 1313 in a 2-room cottage that housed her parents, her 4 older siblings, and usually at least one ailing grandparent. Her father was a villain, a serf bound to the manor lord's land, who worked strips of field that would never belong to him, no matter how many harvests he brought in. Her mother had been a thin, tired woman who never seemed to stop moving from dawn until long after dark, her hands always busy with spinning or mending or kneading or stirring. Agnes's earliest memories were of her mother's worn face in firelight and the constant gnawing emptiness in her own belly that was simply the normal condition of childhood for most medieval peasants. When Agnes was 7 years old, she had watched her mother die giving birth to what would have been a 6th child. The baby, a boy, had lived only 3 hours, his tiny body growing cold despite being wrapped in every scrap of cloth the family possessed. Agnes remembered standing in the corner of that dark room, pressed against the wattle and daub wall, watching as the midwife, an ancient woman named Godith, whose face seemed made entirely of wrinkles, worked over her mother's still form. She remembered the smell of blood, thick and metallic, mixing with the smoke from the inadequate fire. She remembered her father's face, frozen in an expression that seemed caught between grief and simple exhaustion. And she remembered thinking, with the strange clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of crisis, that someone should have been able to help her mother. Someone should have known what to do. After her mother's death, Agnes's life had changed in the way that life changed for all motherless girls in medieval villages. She became, overnight, responsible for her younger siblings, for the cooking and mending an endless round of tasks that kept a peasant household barely functioning. Her childhood, such as it had been, ended that day. By the time she was 9, she could bake bread, tend a fire, card wool, brew weak ale, and manage a household's simple accounts in her head, since she had never learned to read or write. By the time she was 11, she understood that her father would arrange a marriage for her as soon as he could find a man willing to take on another mouth to feed in exchange for her labor. But something had remained with Agnes from that terrible night when her mother died. A stubborn question, perhaps, or a determination that if she ever had a chance to learn the mysteries that old Goddess had known, she would seize it. When she was 14, she had begun accompanying Goddess to births, at first simply carrying the midwife's basket of supplies, the precious stores of dried herbs, the strips of clean linen, the small sharp knife, the vials of oil. Goddess had been reluctant at first to take on an apprentice. Midwifery was not a trade like blacksmithing or weaving, with formal apprenticeships and guild regulations. It was knowledge passed from woman to woman, often guarded jealously, because a midwife's skill was one of the few ways a poor woman could earn coin and respect in a world that offered neither freely to her sex. But Goddess was growing old, her fingers stiffening with what we would now call arthritis, her eyesight dimming. And perhaps she saw something in Agnes, that same stubborn determination, that careful attention to detail, that ability to remain calm when others panicked. Gradually, over months and then years, Goddess had begun to teach her. Not with formal lessons, but by letting Agnes watch, by talking through what she was doing as she did it, by occasionally letting the girls younger, steadier hands perform a task under her watchful eye. Agnes learned that childbirth was always dangerous, but it was especially dangerous in the hovels where most villagers lived. These were structures that barely deserved the name house. 1 or 2 rooms with packed earth floors, walls made of woven branches covered in mud and dung that let wind whistle through the cracks, roofs of thatch that leaked in rain and provided homes for rats and insects. In winter, these hovels were bitterly cold, despite the small fires that burned continuously in the central hearth. The smoke from these fires had no chimney to escape through. Most peasant homes simply had a hole in the roof that let out some of the smoke while letting in rain, snow, and cold air. The result was that the interior of most hovels existed in a permanent haze of eye-stinging smoke that blackened the rafters and lungs alike. She learned that most bobbies were born in these conditions, in dim, smoky rooms where the only light came from the fire, and perhaps 1 or 2 rush lights or tallow candles if the family could afford them. She learned that women labored on straw mattresses that were often damp and always harbored fleas and lice, covered with whatever blankets or cloaks the family possessed. She learned that privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Births happened with other children sleeping in the corner, with grandparents and siblings pressed against the walls, with neighbors coming and going to offer help or simply to witness the drama of new life entering the world. Most importantly, she learned what could go wrong. She learned to recognize when a baby was positioned wrong in the womb and how to try, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to turn it. She learned the difference between normal labor pain and the kind of agony that signaled a woman's womb was tearing. She learned how to deliver twins, how to cut and tie the birth cord, how to deliver the afterbirth and check that it had come out whole. She learned which herbs might help: mugwort to ease pain, shepherd's purse to slow bleeding, raspberry leaf drunk throughout pregnancy to strengthen the womb. She learned which prayers the village priest approved of, and which smacked too much of the old pagan ways that the church was always trying to stamp out. She learned to keep holy relics nearby when she worked: a saint's medal, a scrap of blessed cloth, not because she was certain they helped, but because the laboring women believed they did, and belief itself could be powerful medicine. By the time Agnes was 18, Goddess had died in her sleep one cold November night, and Agnes had found herself the village's midwife almost by default. There was no other woman with her training, and bobbies did not stop coming simply because the old midwife had passed on. That same year, Agnes had married a man named Thomas, a carpenter's assistant 12 years older than herself. It had not been a love match. Few peasant marriages were, but Thomas was neither cruel nor lazy, which made him better than many husbands. He did not beat her when he drank. He brought his wages home, and he had never objected to her continuing her work as a midwife. In fact, he seemed quietly proud of her skill, and the small amounts of coin and payment in kind that she earned helped stretch their limited resources. They had tried for children of their own, and Agnes had conceived 3 times in the first 5 years of their marriage. But she had never carried a child past the 4th month. Each time, the cramping and bleeding had started, and she had lost what might have been a son or daughter. The 3rd time, after the loss of what seemed to have been twin bobbies, the bleeding had been so severe that she had feared for her own life. After that, there had been no more pregnancies, and Agnes had accepted that God or fate or simple bad fortune had decided she would never be a mother herself. The irony of being a midwife who could not carry her own children to term was not lost on her, and sometimes, in dark moments, she wondered if it was a punishment for some sin she could not name. But mostly she tried not to think about it. There was too much work to be done, too many other women's bobbies to deliver, to spend time mourning the children she would never have. Thomas had died suddenly 3 years ago, in the summer of 1344. He had been working on repairs to the manor house roof when he fell, landing badly and breaking his back. He had lived for 2 days after the fall, conscious but unable to move his legs, his breathing growing shallower and more labored until finally it stopped altogether. Agnes had nursed him as best she could in those final days, keeping him clean and trying to get him to take sips of water, knowing all the while that there was nothing she could do to save him. When he died, she had wept, not with the passionate grief of a great love lost, but with the quieter sadness of losing a companion, a familiar presence, a man who had been kind to her in his way. His death had left her alone in their small cottage at the edge of the village. She had no children to support her, no close family left living. But she had her work, and her work had kept her alive. The village women still needed her, and they paid what they could, sometimes a few pennies, more often in trade. A chicken here, a sack of barley there, a length of wool cloth, help with her garden, firewood cut and stacked by a grateful father. It was enough to survive, barely. Agnes grew her own vegetables in the small plot behind her cottage, kept 2 chickens for eggs, and spun wool in the evenings to trade for what she could not grow or make herself. This particular January night had started like many others. Agnes had been sitting by her small fire, her fingers busy with her spindle, when young Peter Alcock had come pounding on her door. Peter was 16, newly married to a girl named Emma, who could not have been more than 15 herself. Emma's time had come early. Peter gasped out, his face pale with fear in the flickering firelight. The baby was not due for another month by Emma's reckoning, but the pains had started that afternoon and were growing stronger. Would Agnes come? Please, would she come now? Agnes had set down her spindle without a word and begun gathering her supplies. She kept them ready always, a basket packed with clean linen strips, her small collection of herbs, the flask of holy water the priest had blessed for her, the birthing stool that Goddess had passed down to her, her sharpest knife. She wrapped herself in her warmest cloak, a garment that had been patched so many times that little of the original cloth remained visible, and pulled her hood up over the linen kerchief that covered her hair. Then she had followed Peter out into the frozen night. The snow was deep, deeper than it had been in years. This winter of 1347 was proving to be brutally cold, even by the standards of medieval England, where winter was always a time of hardship and hunger. The harvest last autumn had been poor. Too much rain in the summer had rotted much of the grain in the fields before it could be gathered. Everyone in the village was hungry, and it was only January. The hungry months of late winter and early spring, when last year's stores ran low, and this year's crops had not yet grown, still stretched ahead. Already there were families boiling tree bark to make a thin gruel, and the very old and very young were beginning to die. Agnes trudged through the snow behind Peter, her breath steaming in the frigid air. The moon was nearly full, hanging huge and bright in a sky scattered with stars. It gave enough light to see by, but it also made the cold seem even more intense, as if the moon itself was a great eye of ice staring down at the frozen world below. Agnes could feel the cold seeping through her worn boots, her toes already going numb. Her fingers, clutched around the handle of her basket, ached with the cold despite her attempts to keep them tucked in her sleeves. She found herself thinking, as she often did on nights like this, about the ladies in the manor house, sleeping in their enclosed beds with their furs and their warming pans filled with hot coals. She wondered if they had any idea how cold it could be, what it felt like to know that there was no real warmth waiting anywhere, that even when you reached your destination, there would only be a small fire struggling against the wind that blew through 100 cracks in the walls. The Alcock cottage was at the far edge of the village, nearly a quarter mile from Agnes's own home. It was one of the poorest dwellings in a village of poor dwellings, a single room that Peter's father had built for his son when the boy married, cobbled together from scavenged timber and whatever else could be found. The thatching on the roof was thin and patchy, already sagging in places. Agnes knew without being told that there would be leaks when the snow melted, and probably drafts even now that made the interior nearly as cold as the outdoors. As they approached, Agnes could hear Emma's cries, high and frightened, carrying clearly through the cold night air. Peter's steps quickened, his anxiety palpable, and Agnes found herself automatically shifting into the calm, focused state of mind that she always assumed when beginning a birthing. Fear and panic would help no one. She needed to be the steady center, the voice of experience and confidence, especially when, she was not entirely confident at all. Inside, the cottage was dim and smoky, lit only by a small fire struggling in the central hearth, and a single tallow candle burning in a corner. The acrid smell of the tallow mixed with wood smoke and the distinctive scent of a laboring woman, sweat and blood and fear. Emma was on the straw mattress that served as the couple's bed, her shift pulled up, her legs drawn up, her face contorted with pain. Peter's mother was there, a worn woman of perhaps 40 who looked 60, and Emma's younger sister Sarah, a girl of 12 who stood pressed against the wall, her eyes enormous with fear. Agnes set down her basket and immediately went to Emma's side, kneeling on the packed earth floor despite the cold that seeped up through her skirts. "Emma, dear," she said softly, taking the girl's hand. "I'm here now. Let's see how you're progressing, shall we?" Emma's hand gripped hers with desperate strength, her palm hot and damp with sweat despite the cold. "It hurts," the girl whimpered. "Agnes, it hurts so much. Something's wrong. The baby isn't supposed to come yet. Something's wrong." "Hush now," Agnes said, her voice low and soothing. "Pain is part of bringing a baby into the world. Let me examine you and we'll see where we are." She looked up at Peter's mother. "I need more light. Can we have another candle?" The woman hesitated, and Agnes saw the calculation in her face. Candles cost money, and money was scarce. But then she nodded and went to light another precious candle from the fire. The additional light helped, though the room remained dim and full of dancing shadows. Agnes gently examined Emma, her practiced fingers checking the girl's progress. What she found made her heart sink, though she kept her expression neutral. The baby was coming early, yes, but it was also positioned wrong. She could feel a tiny foot instead of the head. A breech birth, and Emma was small, her hips narrow, her body perhaps too young to be doing this work. But Agnes had delivered breech bobbies before. It was dangerous, but not impossible. She had turned bobbies in the womb before, though it never became easier, and she had brought forth bobbies feet first when turning them proved impossible. Many of those bobbies had lived, though many had not. And many of the mothers had died, bleeding out before Agnes could do anything to help them. But she had also seen women survive terrible labors and go on to have more children, and bobbies born blue and still, who suddenly gasped and pinked up and lived to grow into sturdy children. "The baby is trying to come out feet first," Agnes said calmly, still holding Emma's hand. "I'm going to see if I can turn the baby so the head comes first. It will be uncomfortable, but we must try." Do you understand? Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. She was so young, Agnes thought, so terribly young. Has she herself ever been that young? It seemed impossible, as if Agnes had been born already old, already tired. Agnes reached into her basket and pulled out a small flask of oil, precious olive oil that she hoarded carefully, using it only when necessary. She poured some onto her hands, warming it between her palms, and then gently, carefully, she began to try to manipulate the baby's position through Emma's belly. The girl screamed, a raw sound of agony that made Peter, standing by the door, look like he might faint. Agnes ignored him, focusing entirely on what her hands were telling her. She could feel the small body inside Emma, could sense its position, and slowly, carefully, she began to coax it around. It took a long time marked by Emma's screams and whimpers, by the anxious breathing of everyone else in the room, by the slow burning down of the candles. Agnes's back ached from bending over, her hands cramped from the careful, sustained pressure, her knees throbbed from the cold floor. But finally, she felt the baby shift, felt the head move down into position. She sat back, breathing hard, her forehead damp with sweat despite the cold. "Good," she said, her voice rough. "That's good. The baby is in the right position now." She looked at Emma's exhausted face. "But the hard work is still ahead, dear one. You'll need to push when the pains come. Can you do that?" Emma nodded weakly, and Agnes prepared for the long wait that often came next. But to her surprise, Emma's body seemed ready to expel the baby now that it was properly positioned. The contractions came hard and fast, and Emma, young as she was, seemed to understand instinctively what to do. She pushed when Agnes told her to push, panted when Agnes told her to rest, and Agnes found herself thinking that perhaps this would go well after all. But nothing in medieval childbirth was ever simple or certain. Just as Agnes saw the dark hair of the baby's head beginning to show, just as she was preparing to guide the infant out into the world, Emma gave a cry that was different from all the others, a sound of shock and a different kind of pain. And suddenly there was blood, far too much blood, hot and dark, soaking through the straw mattress and pooling on the floor. Agnes felt her stomach clench with fear, but her hands moved automatically, doing what they had been trained to do. She delivered the baby quickly, a tiny girl who emerged blue and still, the cord wrapped around her neck. Agnes's knife was in her hand before she even thought about it, cutting through the cord, unwinding it from the baby's throat. She cleared the infant's mouth and nose with her finger, then turned the baby upside down and struck its back firmly, once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The baby hung limp in her hands, its tiny body beginning to cool. Behind her, Emma was still bleeding. Agnes could hear Peter's mother crying, could hear Sarah sobbing, could hear Peter's voice raised in prayer or panic. But her focus was entirely on the small, still form in her hands. She tried again, breathing gently into the tiny mouth, striking the back once more. And this time, oh blessed relief, the baby coughed, spluttered, and then let out a weak, mewling cry. Agnes wrapped the infant quickly in a clean cloth, holding her close to share body heat, and turned back to Emma. The girl was hemorrhaging badly, her face white as snow, her lips blue. Agnes had seen this before. Sometimes a woman's womb simply would not stop bleeding after birth. Sometimes there was a tear, or the womb would not contract as it should, or the bleeding simply could not be stopped no matter what anyone did. Agnes put the baby into Sarah's arms with a quick instruction to keep it warm, and turned all her attention to saving Emma's life. She pressed down on Emma's belly, trying to make the womb contract. She packed cloth against the bleeding, though it soaked through almost immediately. She gave Emma shepherd's purse to chew, though the girl was barely conscious enough to do it. She prayed, words tumbling from her lips automatically, prayers to St. Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, prayers to the Virgin Mary, prayers to any power that might be listening. And all the while, Emma's blood kept flowing, kept soaking through everything Agnes tried to do to stop it. Peter was beside her now, holding his wife's hand, his face streaked with tears. "Save her," he kept saying. "Please, Agnes, save her." But Agnes had no miracles to offer. She had only her skill and her experience and her two tired hands, and sometimes, often, too often, that was not enough. She worked until the candles burned low, until her arms shook with exhaustion, until there was no more blood left in Emma to lose. And then, finally, she sat back on her heels and looked at Peter's stricken face and shook her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Emma died as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the walls, her hand still clutched in her young husband's grip. The baby, tiny and weak but alive, whimpered in Sarah's arms. Agnes sat on the cold floor, her dress and hands stained with blood that was already turning brown, and felt the familiar weight of failure settle on her shoulders. She had saved the baby but lost the mother. Was that success or failure? She could never quite decide. Peter's mother began the keening wail of mourning, and soon other women's voices joined her from other cottages. The sound of death was recognized and echoed throughout the village. Agnes slowly, painfully got to her feet. She needed to wash Emma's body, to prepare it for burial. She needed to make sure the baby was warm and had someone to nurse it. Peter's mother, perhaps, if she could still produce milk. Or else they would need to find another woman in the village who had recently given birth and might be willing to wet nurse another infant for whatever payment Peter could manage. But first, just for a moment, Agnes walked outside into the gray dawn. The snow had stopped falling during the night, and the world was blanketed in white, pristine and beautiful, and completely indifferent to human suffering. Agnes stood in the doorway of the hovel and let the cold air wash over her, cleaning the smell of blood and death from her nostrils, clearing her head. She thought of all the births she had attended in her 16 years as a midwife. Hundreds of them, perhaps. Some had ended joyfully, with healthy bobbies and surviving mothers. Some had ended in tragedy, mothers dead, bobbies dead, sometimes both. Some had ended ambiguously like this one, with life and death balanced on the scales together. She thought of her own lost Bobbies, the children she had never held. She thought of Thomas, dead on that hot summer day 3 years ago. She thought of her mother, bleeding out in that dark cottage so many years ago while 7-year-old Agnes watched from the corner. She thought about how fragile life was, how thin the margin between survival and death, how much depended on simple luck and chance. A baby positioned differently in the womb, a womb that contracted properly after birth instead of continuing to bleed. A mother with wider hips, more strength, better nutrition. Such small things, and yet they meant the difference between life and death, between a baby growing up to become an adult and a tiny body wrapped in cloth and buried in unconsecrated ground because it had died unbaptized. And yet people kept living, kept trying, kept bringing new life into this cold, hard world despite knowing how much could go wrong. Emma had died, but her daughter lived. That small, determined cry, that tiny body that had started to pink up when Agnes wrapped it warm, that was life refusing to be extinguished. That was hope, however fragile. Agnes took a deep breath of the cold air and turned back into the hovel. There was work to be done, and she was the one who would do it. That was her role, her calling, her burden, and her gift. She was the one who welcomed new life into the world, who held the hands of frightened women, who did what could be done even when it was not enough. She was Agnes of Thornbury, midwife, and as long as she lived, no woman in her village would labor alone. The baby, Peter would probably name her Emma after her dead mother, was crying louder now, a good sign. Agnes went to check on her, her blood-stained hands gentle as she unwrapped the clothes to examine the tiny body. The baby was early, yes, and small, but her lungs were strong and her limbs moved with vigor. She would need careful tending these first weeks, would need to be kept warm and fed, but she might well survive. Agnes had seen Bobbies born even earlier who had lived to adulthood. She showed Peter's mother how to wrap the baby snugly, how to keep her warm against her body. She mixed a thin pap of bread soaked in weak ale and honey. Not ideal, but better than nothing until they could find a wet nurse. She helped wash Emma's body, combing her long hair one last time, closing her eyes, crossing her hands over her chest. She said the prayers that needed to be said, doing the work that fell to women in these dark hours. By the time the sun had fully risen, turning the snow-covered world bright and almost painfully beautiful, Agnes was finally able to leave. Peter pressed 2 pennies into her hand, probably all the coins he possessed in the world, and she took them without comment. She needed them too badly to refuse, though the weight of them in her palm felt heavy with Emma's death. She wrapped her cloak around herself and began the trudge back to her own cottage through the snow, her basket lighter now that so many of her supplies had been used. The village was stirring to life around her. Smoke rose from other hovels as fires were built up for the day. A few other early risers were out, a man heading to the manor's fields, a woman drawing water from the well, children chasing each other through the snow with the resilience of youth. Life went on. It always did. Emma was dead, but the world did not stop turning for one peasant girl's death. Agnes reached her cottage as the church bells rang for prime, the first service of the day. She paused at her door, listening to the familiar sound echoing across the frozen fields. Father Benedict would be standing in the cold church now, intoning the Latin prayers that most of his parishioners could not understand. Agnes herself knew only a few words of Latin, the prayers she had learned by rote, the names of saints, the phrases that marked the rhythm of the church year. But she found comfort in the bells nonetheless, in their steady marking of time, in the way they reminded her that she was part of something larger than her own small life. Inside her cottage, the fire had burned down to embers during the long night she had been away. Agnes set down her basket and immediately set about rebuilding it, feeding the glowing coals with carefully hoarded twigs and then larger pieces of wood. She could not afford to let the fire go out completely. Starting it again with flint and steel was difficult work, and she had no neighbor close enough to borrow fire from easily. The fire was life itself in winter, the difference between freezing and surviving, between being able to cook food and eating everything raw and cold. As the flames began to catch and grow, Agnes pulled off her blood-stiffened dress. She would need to soak it in cold water to get the worst of the stains out, then wash it properly when the weather warmed enough to make such work bearable. For now, she folded it carefully and set it aside, then poured water from her pitcher into her single bowl and began to wash herself. The water was icy cold, and her whole body shuddered at the touch of it, but she scrubbed her hands and arms thoroughly, watching as the water turned pink with Emma's blood. She thought about infection and contagion, concepts that medieval people understood only dimly, if at all. Agnes had noticed over the years that women seemed to do better when the midwife washed her hands before examining them, when the clothes used were clean rather than dirty. She had learned this from Godith, who had learned it from her own teacher, wisdom passed down through generations of women who observed and remembered even if they could not explain why their practices worked. The physicians and surgeons who sometimes came through the village, with their university training and their Latin texts, often mocked such female wisdom. But Agnes had seen their patients die of putrid wounds and fevered infections at least as often as her own laboring mothers did, so she trusted her own experience and the experience of the women who had taught her. Once she was as clean as she could manage with cold water, Agnes put on her other dress. She owned only two, alternating between them, washing one while wearing the other. This one was slightly less patched than the blood-stained one, made of rough wool that scratched against her skin but held in warmth. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, stirred the fire again, and then sat down heavily on her single stool. She was so tired, the kind of tiredness that went bone deep, that made her whole body ache. She had been awake for over 24 hours, and most of that time had been spent in intense physical and emotional labor. Her knees throbbed from kneeling on cold floors. Her back ached from bending over Emma. Her hands cramped from the careful, sustained work of trying to turn that baby. And underneath the physical exhaustion was the deeper weariness of loss, of watching another young woman die, of knowing that she had done everything she knew how to do and it had not been enough. She should eat something, she knew. She had a little bread left from 3 days ago, now hard as stone but still edible if soaked in ale or water. She had 2 eggs from her chickens, precious things that she usually tried to save to trade for other goods. She had some dried peas and a bit of barley, but the thought of preparing food, of making the effort to cook, seemed overwhelming. Instead, she simply sat by the fire, letting its warmth seep into her cold bones, letting her mind drift. She found herself thinking about Emma, not Emma dying, but Emma as she had been. Agnes had known the girl since she was born. She remembered Emma's own mother laboring in this same village 15 years ago, remembered the healthy, squalling infant she had delivered, remembered watching that infant grow into a toddler, then a child, then a young woman. Emma had been a bright girl, quick with a smile, good with her hands. She had helped her mother in the fields, had learned to spin and weave, had sung in church with a clear, sweet voice. And then, as happened to all peasant girls who survived childhood, she had been married off. Peter Alcock was not a bad choice. He was young and strong, willing to work, not known to be cruel or drunken. But he was poor, so poor that the cottage he had built for his bride was barely better than a shed. And now Emma was dead at 15, having lived long enough to grow to womanhood but not long enough to see her daughter grow. The baby, if she survived, would never know her mother, would grow up with only stories told by others. She would be raised by Peter's mother, or by whatever woman Peter could afford to pay or marry to help care for his child. That was the way of things. Life was brutally hard, and people adapted as they could, moving forward because there was no choice but to move forward. Agnes dozed by the fire, her head nodding forward, then jerking up as she caught herself falling asleep. She needed to rest properly, but her mind would not quiet. It kept circling back to the birth, replaying moments, questioning her choices. Should she have tried to turn the baby sooner? Should she have let it come breech rather than risk the manipulation? Had the turning itself somehow caused the hemorrhage, or would Emma have bled regardless? These were questions with no answers, but that did not stop them from haunting her. A knock at her door startled her fully awake. She rose stiffly and opened it to find young Sarah, Emma's sister, standing in the snow. The girl's face was blotchy from crying, her eyes red-rimmed. In her arms she carried a small bundle, the baby. "Agnes," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Mother sent me. She says we cannot keep the baby. Peter's mother has no milk. Her last baby was 3 years ago. And we have no coin to pay a wet nurse. Mother says," the girl's voice broke. "Mother says you must find someone who can take her, or we will have to leave her at the church door and hope the monks will care for her." Agnes felt her heart sink. She had known this was coming, had known even as she helped bring that baby into the world that its survival would depend on finding someone willing and able to nurse it. Abandoning babies at church doors was not uncommon. The monastery sometimes took in such foundlings, though their survival rate was poor. More often, the babies simply died of cold and hunger before anyone found them. "Bring her inside," Agnes said quietly. Sarah stepped into the cottage, and Agnes closed the door against the cold. She took the baby from the girl's arms and unwrapped the clothes to examine her. The infant was awake, her dark eyes. All Bobbies seemed to have dark eyes at first, staring up unfocused. Her tiny mouth worked, rooting instinctively for a breast that was not there. She was hungry, Agnes realized, desperately hungry. The thin pap they had given her earlier was not enough, could never be enough for a newborn who needed milk. "Wait here," Agnes told Sarah. She went to her corner cupboard and took out one of her precious eggs and her last crust of bread. She broke the egg into her bowl, added a little water and some bread crumbs, and mashed it all together. It was not milk, not even close, but it was nourishment. She dipped a clean cloth into the mixture and let the baby suck on it. The infant latched onto the cloth desperately, her tiny mouth working, her small body pressing against Agnes's arm with surprising strength. As she fed the baby, Agnes's mind raced through the village women she knew, who had recently given birth, who might have milk to spare. There was Marjorie Cooper, who had delivered a son 2 months ago. But Marjorie had 5 other children and barely enough to feed them all. There was Joan Miller, whose baby girl was 4 months old, but Joan's milk had always been scanty, and her own baby was small and sickly. There was Alice Weaver, who had given birth just 3 weeks ago to twin boys, but twins meant she needed all her milk for her own children. Wait. Agnes paused, thinking. There was one other possibility, though it was a long shot. Margaret of the red hair, called that to distinguish her from the many other Margarets in the village, had lost her baby just a week ago. The child had been stillborn, a boy who had never drawn breath. Margaret had been devastated and had barely left her cottage since. But she would still have milk, her body not yet understanding that there was no baby to feed. If Margaret could be convinced to nurse Emma's baby, it might save both of them, the infant from starvation, and Margaret from the deep melancholy that sometimes consumed women after such losses. "I know someone who might help," Agnes said to Sarah. "Margaret, you know, the one who lives near the mill. Her baby died, but she may still be able to nurse." Sarah's face brightened with hope, but then fell again. "Peter has no money to pay her. He gave you his last pennies." Agnes looked down at the baby in her arms, at the tiny face, at the small fingers curled into fists. She thought of Emma, dead at 15. She thought of her own lost Bobbies, the children she had never held. She made a decision that she knew was probably foolish. That might leave her hungry later, but that felt like the only possible choice. "I will speak to Margaret," she said. "I will see what can be arranged. Take the baby back for now and feed her this way." She demonstrated with the cloth soaked in egg mixture, every 2 hours if you can manage it. "Keep her warm. I will come to you this evening with news." After Sarah left, Agnes sat down again by her fire and allowed herself a few moments of weakness. She put her face in her hands and let a few tears fall. Not many, for she had learned long ago that tears changed nothing and used up energy she could not spare. But a few tears for Emma, for the baby who might not survive, for all the hard choices and impossible situations that made up the daily reality of medieval life. Then she wiped her eyes, wrapped herself in her cloak, and set out into the cold day once more. She had work to do. Margaret of the red hair lived in a cottage near the village mill, close enough to hear the constant grinding of the millstones when the wheel was turning. Agnes trudged through the snow toward it, her feet following paths she had walked hundreds of times before. The village was small enough that she knew every house, every family, every story of birth and death, and everything in between. She found Margaret sitting alone in her dark cottage, staring at nothing. The fire was burning low, and the room was bitterly cold. Margaret herself looked like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her famous red hair hanging lank and uncombed around her shoulders, her eyes hollow. On a small shelf in the corner sat a tiny wooden cross that her husband had carved, the only marker for the baby who had never lived. "Margaret," Agnes said gently, kneeling beside the woman. "I've come to talk with you." Margaret turned her head slowly, as if the effort of moving was almost too much. "Go away, Agnes. I have nothing to say, but I have something to ask you. Something important." Agnes reached out and took Margaret's cold hand. "There is a baby who needs a mother. Emma Alcock died last night in childbirth, but her daughter lives. The infant needs milk, or she will die. Your body still has milk, Margaret. You could save this child." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then slowly, her eyes focused on Agnes's face. "My baby is dead," she whispered. "Why should another woman's baby live when mine is dead?" It was a fair question in its way. Agnes had heard such questions before, had felt them herself in the dark months after her third miscarriage. Why did some bobbies live while others died? Why did some women carry their children to term while others lost them? Why was life distributed so unfairly, so randomly? "I don't know," Agnes said honestly. "I don't know why your son died. I don't know why God or fate or chance is so cruel. But I do know that there is a living baby who will die without help. And I know that you could help her if you chose to." "Peter Alcock has no money to pay me," Margaret said flatly. "No, he doesn't. But I will pay you." The words were out before Agnes had fully thought them through, but once said, she knew they were true. She would find a way somehow. She would take payment in trade, would scrimp and save, and would go hungry herself if necessary. But she would not let that baby die for lack of a wet nurse. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and Agnes saw something flicker in those hollow eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the faint stirring of something that might have been hope. "Why?" Margaret asked. "Why would you pay me to nurse another woman's baby?" Agnes considered the question. Why indeed? She had no good reason, no practical justification. She was not wealthy, could not afford charity. The baby was nothing to her, not her own, not even a relative. By all rights, she should let nature take its course. Let the baby die or survive as fate decreed. But she thought of Emma's face, young and frightened, trusting Agnes to help her. She thought of that tiny body in her hands, blue and still, and then suddenly, miraculously, alive. She thought of what old Goddess had once told her, that being a midwife meant standing between life and death, meant fighting for life even when the odds seemed impossible, meant refusing to give up as long as there was any chance at all. Because I delivered her, Agnes said simply. I brought her into this world, and I will not give up on her without a fight. Will you help me? Margaret was silent for so long that Agnes thought she would refuse. But then slowly, the woman nodded. Bring the baby to me, she said quietly. I will try. Agnes felt relief flood through her, so intense it was almost painful. She squeezed Margaret's hand. Thank you. I will bring her this afternoon, and Margaret, this may help you too. Grief is easier to bear when you have someone to care for. She was not sure if that was true, but she hoped it might be. She had seen it before. Women who had lost their own bobbies sometimes found healing in caring for another child. Not always, but sometimes. And even if it did not heal Margaret's grief, at least it might give her a reason to get up in the morning to eat, to keep living through the dark months ahead. Agnes spent the rest of the day making arrangements. She spoke with Peter, who was too deep in shock and grief to do much but nod at whatever she suggested. She spoke with Peter's mother, who was relieved to have the burden of the baby lifted from her shoulders. She gathered the baby and what few clothes Sarah had been able to find for her, scraps of cloth, mostly, wrapped and tied to form makeshift swaddling. She stopped by her own cottage to collect the 2 pennies Peter had paid her, knowing she would give them to Margaret along with whatever else she could scrape together over the coming weeks. By afternoon, she was at Margaret's door again, the baby in her arms. Margaret had clearly made an effort in the hours since Agnes's visit. The fire was built up, the cottage was warmer, and Margaret herself had combed her hair and changed into a cleaner dress. She looked nervous, frightened even, as Agnes handed her the baby. I don't know if I can do this, Margaret whispered, looking down at the tiny face. What if I fail? What if she dies too? You won't fail, Agnes said firmly. Your body knows what to do. Just put her to your breast. Margaret did, fumbling at first, and for a terrible moment Agnes thought the baby would not latch on. But then the infant's mouth found the nipple, and she began to suck with the fierce determination of the starving. Margaret gasped at the sensation, her eyes filling with tears. The milk began to flow, and the baby nursed hungrily, her small hands flexing against Margaret's breast. Agnes watched for a few minutes, making sure all was well, and then quietly slipped out of the cottage. She walked home through the gathering dusk, her arms empty now, her basket light. She was hungry and tired and bone cold, but she felt something that might have been peace. She had done what she could. The baby might live or die. That was in God's hands now, or fate's, or simply chance. But Agnes had fought for her, had refused to let her die without trying, and that was all any midwife could do. Over the following days and weeks, Agnes fell back into the rhythm of her daily life. She spun wool in the evenings, turning raw fleece into thread that she could trade for food or other necessities. She tended her chickens, collecting their eggs when they could be coaxed to lay in the cold weather. She worked in other ways too, sometimes helping with brewing, sometimes with herb gathering when the ground was not too frozen, sometimes simply sitting with sick or dying villagers, offering what comfort she could. And she attended births. In late January, she delivered Joan Carpenter's fourth child, a healthy boy who came easily and quickly. In early February, she helped bring Maud Smith's first baby into the world, a difficult birth that lasted 2 days but ended well with both mother and baby surviving. In mid-February, she delivered Alice Turner's fifth child, a girl born so quickly that Agnes barely arrived in time. Each birth was different. Each carried its own anxieties and challenges. But Agnes had learned over the years to take them one at a time, to focus on the woman in front of her, the baby fighting to be born, the immediate practical concerns of keeping everyone warm and safe and alive. She could not control the outcome, but she could control her own actions, her own effort, her own refusal to give up. She visited Margaret and the baby, whom Peter had indeed named Emma after her dead mother, several times a week. The baby was thriving under Margaret's care, growing stronger and more alert. Margaret herself seemed transformed by having an infant to care for. The hollow look had left her eyes, replaced by a tired but genuine warmth when she looked down at little Emma. Agnes knew that Margaret still grieved for her own lost child, that grief would never entirely leave her, but the living baby in her arms had given her a reason to keep going, to keep fighting through each difficult day. Agnes had paid Margaret the 2 pennies Peter had given her, and then found other ways to help support the arrangement. She brought Margaret eggs from her chickens. She traded some of her thread for barley and passed half of it on to Margaret. She picked up small payments from other births and slipped some of those coins to Margaret as well. It meant Agnes herself was hungrier than usual that winter, her own portions smaller, her own supplies more depleted. But she could not regret it. Every time she saw little Emma nursing contentedly, every time she saw Margaret smile down at the baby, she knew she had made the right choice. February slowly gave way to March, and March to April. The snow began to melt, turning the village paths into rivers of mud. The frozen ground softened, and people began to think about spring planting. Food supplies were desperately low now. This was the hungry time, the weeks when last year's harvest was almost gone, and this year's crops had not yet grown. People ate anything they could find, nettles and wild garlic, tree bark boiled into a thin gruel, even grass when nothing else was available. The very old and very weak began to die, their bodies too depleted to survive the lean weeks of early spring. Agnes herself grew thinner, her belt needing to be tightened another notch, her face becoming more gaunt. But she kept working, kept trudging through the mud to attend births, kept sitting with laboring women through long, cold nights. In April alone, she delivered 6 bobbies, 4 who lived, 2 who died. The odds were better than usual, and she took it as a good sign. Perhaps this year will be easier than the last. Perhaps the harvest would be good, and the winter that followed less brutal. In early May, Agnes was called to attend a birth that would stay with her for the rest of her life. The laboring woman was Isabel, the wife of Robert of Oakwood, one of the more prosperous peasants in the village. Robert held a full virgate of land, about 30 acres, and he paid his rent to the manor lord in coin rather than labor services, a sign of relative wealth and status. His house was larger than most, with 2 rooms and a proper loft, and Isabel had always been well fed and well clothed by village standards. But prosperity did not guarantee an easy birth. Isabel had been in labor for 3 days when Agnes was finally called. She had initially tried to deliver with only her sister and mother helping, unwilling to pay a midwife's fee. But by the 3rd day, with no progress and Isabel growing weaker, Robert had swallowed his pride and his reluctance to spend money and sent for Agnes. Agnes arrived to find Isabel in a bad state, exhausted, fevered, barely conscious. The baby had been trying to come for 3 days, and Agnes could see immediately that it was stuck, its head partially emerged but unable to come further. This was every midwife's nightmare, a baby trapped in the birth canal, too far in to go back, too stuck to come forward. If nothing was done, both mother and baby would die, probably within hours. Agnes had seen this situation before, and she knew there was only one option, though it was terrible. She would have to cut the baby to pieces inside the womb and remove it in parts, sacrificing the child in hopes of saving the mother. It was brutal, horrible work, but it was the only way. The baby was almost certainly already dead. No child could survive being stuck for 3 days, and if Agnes did nothing, Isabel would die too. She explained this to Robert, her voice steady despite her own horror at what she was about to do. Robert's face went gray, but he nodded. "Save my wife," he said hoarsely. "We can have other children, but I cannot replace Isabel." Agnes prepared herself mentally for what came next. She had performed this procedure twice before, and both times it had haunted her for weeks afterward. But there was no choice. She took out her sharpest knife, the one she used to cut birth cords and occasionally for other surgical purposes. She said a prayer to God, to Saint Margaret, to anyone who might be listening, and then she began. The work was as terrible as she remembered. She tried to focus on the technical aspects, on making clean cuts, on removing the pieces carefully so as not to damage Isabel's womb further. She tried not to think about the fact that this had been a baby, a person who might have grown up to have a life, a name, a story. She tried not to think about her own lost children, about Emma Alcock, about all the Bobbies who never got the chance to live. It took hours. Isabel was barely conscious through most of it, which was a mercy. Agnes's hands shook by the end, and she was covered in blood once again. But finally, she had removed all the pieces of the dead child. She packed clean clothes against Isabel's bleeding, gave her shepherd's purse and other herbs, and then simply waited to see if the woman would survive or if the damage and blood loss would kill her anyway. Isabel survived. It took weeks of careful nursing, with Agnes visiting daily to check on her recovery, but the woman pulled through. She was weak for a long time, and Agnes warned her that she might never be able to have children again after such trauma. But she lived, and in a world where maternal mortality was so high, where Agnes had seen so many young women die in childbirth, that seemed like a miracle enough. Robert paid Agnes more for that delivery than she had ever been paid before, a full shilling, plus a hen and a sack of barley. It was more wealth than Agnes had seen in months, and she accepted it gratefully, knowing it would help her survive the coming weeks. But no amount of payment could erase the memory of what she had done, the image of that knife in her hand, the reality of having to destroy one life in the desperate hope of saving another. This was the darker side of midwifery, the part that Agnes never spoke about in casual conversation. People saw the joy of healthy babies being born, but they did not see the dead infants, the exhausted women bleeding out, the impossible choices between mother and child. They did not understand the weight that came with being the one who made those choices, who decided when to keep trying and when to give up, who literally held life and death in her hands. That night, alone in her cottage, Agnes allowed herself to break down. She sat by her fire and wept, great racking sobs that shook her whole body. She wept for the baby she had just killed, even though it had probably already been dead. She wept for Emma Alcock, dead at 15. She wept for Isabel, who had survived but might never bear the children she longed for. She wept for her own lost bobbies, for Thomas dead these 3 years, for her mother dead so long ago. She wept for all the pain and loss and grief that filled the medieval world, for the casual brutality of existence in a time when life was cheap and death was everywhere. But in the morning, she wiped her eyes and got up and went on. Because that was what people did. They mourned and then they continued. There was no other choice. As spring turned to summer, the rhythm of life in the village began to improve. The first crops were ready for harvest, peas and beans and early grains. The livestock that had survived the harsh winter began to put on weight again as fresh grass grew in the meadows. People's bellies were no longer quite so painfully empty, and the constant specter of starvation receded, at least for a few months. Agnes continued her work. In June, she delivered twins for Sarah Mason, both healthy boys who nursed strongly. In July, she helped bring forth Alice Woodward's first child, a girl born in the cool hours just after dawn. In August, she attended the birth of Margaret Fletcher's 7th baby, another smooth and easy delivery that reminded Agnes that not all births ended in tragedy. She also continued to visit Margaret of the red hair and baby Emma. The child was 6 months old now, thriving and healthy. She had her mother's dark hair and what looked like it might be her father Peter's gray eyes. She smiled now when she saw Agnes, a gummy, joyful smile that made something in Agnes's chest ache. Peter came to visit his daughter regularly, and Agnes could see him slowly bonding with the child, though the sight of her must remind him constantly of his dead wife. Margaret had grown genuinely attached to the baby, treating her almost as if she were her own daughter. Agnes knew there would come a time, probably when Emma was weaned in another year or so, when she would have to go back to her father's household. But for now, this arrangement worked. The baby had a mother figure who loved her. Margaret had a purpose that kept her going, and Peter had the space to grieve without the overwhelming responsibility of caring for an infant alone. In late August, Agnes was called to a birth that would test all her skills and experience. The laboring woman was Catherine, the wife of the manor lord's bailiff, a man of some importance in the village hierarchy. Catherine was in her late 30s, old by medieval standards for childbearing, and this was her first pregnancy. She had been married before but had never conceived with her first husband. When he died of a fever, she had married the bailiff, and everyone had assumed she was barren. But then, at 37, she found herself pregnant. The birth was going wrong from the start. Catherine was in agony, her body struggling with labor in a way that suggested something was badly amiss. Agnes examined her and felt her heart sink. The baby was large, perhaps too large for Catherine's narrow pelvis. And the baby was not positioned correctly, not breech exactly, but at an odd angle that meant it could not descend properly into the birth canal. Agnes tried everything she knew. She tried to turn the baby. She had Catherine walk and squat and try different positions. She gave her herbs to strengthen contractions, prayed over her with holy relics, massaged her belly. Nothing worked. Hours passed, then a full day, then 2 days. Catherine was growing weaker, her screams fading to whimpers, her face ashen with exhaustion and pain. The bailiff, a hard man named Edmund who was used to having his orders obeyed, demanded that Agnes save both his wife and child. But Agnes knew that was becoming increasingly unlikely. She had seen this situation before. When a baby was too large or positioned too poorly to be born naturally, the mother would eventually die from exhaustion or infection or internal damage. And the baby, trapped and unable to emerge, would die as well. On the 3rd day, with Catherine barely conscious and clearly fatting, Agnes made a decision. It was desperate and dangerous, but it was the only chance either of them had. She would attempt to cut the baby out of Catherine's womb. It was a procedure she had heard of but never performed, the ancient Roman practice of caesarean section, named for Julius Caesar, who was supposedly born that way. In Agnes's time, it was rarely attempted because it was almost always fatal to the mother. But Catherine was dying anyway. At least this way, there was a small chance the baby might survive. She explained her plan to Edmund, whose face went white. "That will kill her," he said flatly. "She is already dying," Agnes replied, her voice steady despite her terror at what she was proposing. "This way, we might at least save the child." Edmund stared at his wife's unconscious form for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it." Agnes prepared herself. She had never done this before, had only heard stories of how it might be done, but she was a practical woman, skilled with her hands and her knife. She said every prayer she knew, then made a careful cut through Catherine's belly, through the layers of skin and muscle and fat, until she could see the womb itself. She cut into that as well, and then she was lifting the baby out. A large boy, blue and still, but perhaps not yet dead. She cut the cord, cleared the baby's airway, and struck its back. Nothing. She tried again, breathing into the tiny mouth, willing life into the small body. And then, like a miracle, the baby coughed and drew breath and let out a weak cry. Behind her, Catherine was hemorrhaging massively, just as Agnes had known she would. Agnes handed the baby to Edmund, who took his son with shaking hands and turned back to try to save the mother. But she knew it was futile. There was simply too much damage, too much blood loss. Catherine died without regaining consciousness, and Agnes could only hope that the woman had been too far gone to feel the pain of that final cut. Edmund cradled his newborn son, staring down at the tiny, blood-smeared face with an expression Agnes could not quite read. Was it a wonder, horror, grief, perhaps all three at once? The baby, who would be named Edmund after his father, as was customary for a firstborn son, continued his thin, reedy crying, the sound seeming impossibly fragile in the heavy silence of the room. Agnes worked mechanically to prepare Catherine's body, her hands moving through familiar rituals even as her mind reeled from what she had just done. She had cut a living woman open. She had reached inside and pulled out a child. That Catherine had been dying already, that there had been no other choice. These facts did not make the reality any less staggering. Agnes had crossed some invisible line and had done something that felt almost like playing God. She washed Catherine's body as best she could, trying to make the terrible wound less visible. She arranged the woman's arms across her chest, combed her hair, and closed her eyes. Catherine had been a handsome woman, tall and strong-featured, and even in death she maintained a certain dignity. She had been kind to Agnes on the few occasions they had spoken, kinder than many women of her station were to a village midwife. And now she was dead at 37, having survived so many years only to die bringing her first child into the world. "The baby will need a wet nurse," Agnes said quietly to Edmund, who still stood frozen, staring at his son. "He needs milk, and he needs it soon." Edmund seemed to shake himself out of his stupor. "Find one," he said, his voice rough. "I will pay whatever is necessary." Agnes nodded. Edmund had the means to pay. Unlike poor Peter Alcock with his 2 pennies, the bailiff could afford to hire a wet nurse and pay her well. That, at least, was one less burden on Agnes's conscience. This baby would not starve. She left the bailiff's fine house. It was a proper house, not a hovel, with glazed windows and a tiled roof and separate rooms for different purposes, and walked back through the village as the sun was setting. The summer evening was warm, the air thick with the smell of ripening grain and the sound of insects. It should have been peaceful, but Agnes felt nothing but exhaustion and a kind of numb horror at what she had done. She went directly to see Joan Miller, whose own baby daughter was now 8 months old. Joan's milk had improved since winter, and her baby was thriving. Agnes explained the situation, carefully leaving out the details of how young Edmund had been born, saying only that his mother had died in childbirth. Joan agreed immediately. The bailiff's coin was more than she could earn in months of other work, and within the hour, Baby Edmund was nursing at Joan's breast while his father sat in a chair nearby, his face like stone. Agnes walked home in the gathering darkness, too tired even to feel relief that the baby had survived. She knew that the story of this birth would spread through the village quickly. Catherine's death, the miraculous survival of the baby, Agnes's role in both. She wondered what people would say, whether they would praise her for saving the child or blame her for Catherine's death. Probably both, depending on who was speaking. She reached her cottage and immediately collapsed onto her straw mattress without even bothering to undress or bank the fire properly. She fell into a sleep so deep it was almost like unconsciousness, a sleep without dreams or awareness, her body shutting down to protect itself from the trauma of the day. She woke the next morning to pounding on her door. For a confused moment, she thought she had been asleep only for minutes, but the sunlight streaming through the cracks in her walls told her it was already mid-morning. She dragged herself up, her body aching in every joint, and opened the door to find Father Benedict standing there. Father Benedict was an old man, nearly 60, who had been the village priest for as long as Agnes could remember. He was not a kind man, exactly, too stern and rigid in his faith for that, but he was not cruel either. He took his duties seriously, ministering to his flock with a dedication that Agnes respected even if she did not always agree with his views. "Agnes," he said, his face gravely, "I need to speak with you about what happened yesterday." Agnes's heart sank. She knew what was coming. The church had strict views about childbirth, about the proper role of midwives, about what was and was not acceptable practice. Cutting open a woman's body, even to save a child, might well be seen as overstepping those boundaries. "Come in, Father," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him enter. He stood in the center of her small cottage, seeming to fill the space with his presence despite being a relatively small man. "Tell me exactly what you did," he said. "I have heard rumors, but I want to hear the truth from you." Agnes told him, leaving nothing out. She described Catherine's labor, the baby's position, and the slow deterioration over 3 days. She described her decision to attempt the surgery, Edmund's permission, the cut she had made, and the baby she had pulled from his dying mother's womb. She spoke calmly, factually, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Father Benedict listened in silence, his face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You know that what you did is not sanctioned by the church. The proper role of a midwife is to assist in natural birth, not to cut into a woman's body as a surgeon might." "I know, Father. But Catherine was dying. The baby was dying. I saw a chance to save one of them, and I took it. And in doing so, you hastened the mother's death." "No, Father. Her death was already certain. I only tried to save what could be saved." He studied her face for a long moment, and Agnes forced herself to meet his eyes, to not look away. Finally, he sighed. "I am not entirely certain you were wrong," he said slowly. "The preservation of an innocent life, especially a baptized Christian soul, which that baby will be once I christen him, is a worthy goal. But Agnes, you must be careful. There are those in the church hierarchy who would view what you did as witchcraft, as trafficking with the devil. If word of this reaches beyond our village. He did not need to finish the sentence. Agnes knew well enough what happened to women accused of witchcraft. Torture, trial by ordeal, execution. It did not matter if the accusations were true or false. Once suspicion fell on a woman, especially a poor woman without powerful protectors, her fate was often sealed. I understand, Father, Agnes said quietly. I will be careful. See that you are. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it is worth, I think you showed great courage yesterday. Not many would have dared to try what you did. Young Edmund lives because of you, and that is not nothing. After he left, Agnes sat down heavily on her stool. She had been half expecting Father Benedict to forbid her from practicing as a midwife, to declare her work sinful or heretical. His qualified approval was more than she had hoped for, but his warning was clear. She had crossed a line, and she needed to be very careful about what she did next. Over the following weeks, the story of Catherine's death and baby Edmund's miraculous survival spread not just through the village, but to neighboring settlements as well. Some people praised Agnes for her skill and daring. Others whispered that there was something unnatural about what she had done, that no woman should have such knowledge, that perhaps she had made a bargain with dark forces to gain her abilities. Agnes kept her head down and continued her work. She delivered bobbies, sat with the sick, helped lay out the dead. She tried to be useful and unremarkable, to blend back into the fabric of village life. But she could feel eyes on her sometimes, speculative glances, whispered conversations that stopped when she came near. She had become the subject of gossip and speculation, and that was a dangerous thing for any woman, but especially for one who worked with the mysteries of birth and death. In September, she was called to attend the birth of a woman named Beatrice, whose labor was progressing normally. But when Agnes arrived at the cottage, she found several village women already there, and the atmosphere was tense and hostile in a way she could not quite understand. When she moved to examine Beatrice, one of the women, old Marjorie Smith, a bitter woman who had never liked Agnes, stepped forward and blocked her way. "We don't need your help," Marjorie said, her voice sharp. "We can manage this birth ourselves, without any unnatural interference." Agnes felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "I was sent for," she said calmly. "Beatrice's husband came to my door and asked me to come." "Well, we're sending you away again," another woman said, Alice Cooper, Marjorie's daughter-in-law. "We've talked about it, and we don't want someone who cuts open living women anywhere near Beatrice." "Catherine was dying," Agnes said, keeping her voice level despite the fear rising in her chest. "I saved her baby." That is what a midwife is supposed to do, preserve life wherever possible. A midwife is supposed to help women birth their bobbies naturally, Marjorie spat. Not play at being a surgeon. Not traffic with dark knowledge that no woman should possess. How do we know? You didn't use witchcraft to bring that baby out alive. How do we know you haven't been using witchcraft all along? The word hung in the air like poison. Witchcraft. The accusation that could destroy a woman's life, that could lead to torture and execution. Agnes felt her blood run cold, but she forced herself to remain calm. I use no witchcraft, she said firmly. I use only the knowledge that was passed down to me by Goddess, who learned it from her teacher, who learned it from hers. I use herbs that grow in the fields and forests, prayers that Father Benedict himself has approved, and the skill of my own hands. There is nothing unnatural about what I do. Then why did Father Benedict come to see you? Alice demanded. We all saw him at your door the morning after Catherine died. Was he warning you about your dark practices? He came to ask me what happened, and I told him. He did not forbid me from continuing my work. Agnes looked around at the hostile faces. But if you do not want my help, I will not force it on you. Beatrice, is this what you want? The laboring woman on the bed looked torn, her face tight with pain and confusion. Lie. I don't know, she whispered. I'm frightened. Everyone is saying such things. Agnes felt a deep weariness settle over her. This was how it started, she knew. This was how women were isolated, their reputations destroyed, their usefulness to their communities undermined. First the whispers, then the accusations, then the formal charges. She had seen it happen before to other women, healers, midwives, anyone who possessed knowledge that seemed mysterious or threatening to others. Very well, she said quietly. I will go. But Beatrice, if you need me, send for me. I will come, regardless of what these women say. She left the cottage and walked home through the September sunshine, her basket unused, her services rejected for the first time in her 16 years as a midwife. She felt angry and frightened and deeply, deeply tired. She had spent her entire adult life helping women, easing their pain, fighting to save them and their bobbies. And now she was being punished for that, accused of darkness when all she had ever tried to do was bring light. That night, lying on her straw mattress and listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep, Agnes allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fear. What if the whispers did not die down? What if more women refused her help? What if the accusations escalated, spreading beyond the village to the manor lord or even to the bishop's court? She had no powerful protectors, no wealth to buy influence, no family to speak on her behalf. She was a lone woman, a widow, and in the medieval world, such women were vulnerable in ways that were almost unimaginable. But she could not give up her work. It was all she knew, all she was. Without her role as midwife, she would have no way to earn her living, no purpose, no identity. And more than that, she genuinely believed in what she did. She believed that every baby deserved a fighting chance at life, that every laboring woman deserved skilled help and compassionate care. She believed that the knowledge she carried, passed down through generations of women who had observed and learned and remembered, was valuable and worth preserving. So she made a decision. She would continue her work, but she would be more careful. She would avoid anything that might seem too dramatic or unusual. She would rely more heavily on prayers and holy relics, less on her own skills and knowledge. She would make herself as unremarkable as possible, hoping that the gossip would eventually die down and people would forget their suspicions. It was a strategy born of fear and compromise, and Agnes hated every aspect of it. But it was also practical, and survival in the medieval world required practicality above all else. The next morning, she learned that Beatrice had delivered a healthy daughter with the help of Marjorie and Alice. The birth had gone smoothly, and everyone was well. Agnes felt a complex mixture of relief and resentment. Relief that mother and baby had survived, resentment that she had not been allowed to help, that her years of experience and skill had been rejected in favor of gossip and fear. But she swallowed her pride and continued on. In October, she was called to a birth in the next village over, a place far enough away that the gossip about Catherine's death had not yet reached. She delivered a healthy boy for a woman named Catherine and received payment in the form of a goose and a bag of apples. In November, back in her own village, she helped deliver twins for Emma Wright, and both Bobbies and the mother survived. The successful birth seemed to ease some of the tension, and fewer hostile glances followed Agnes as she moved through the village. Winter came again, hard and cold like the one before. Agnes found herself once more trudging through snow and ice to attend births in freezing hovels, her hands numb, her body aching with cold and exhaustion. But she kept going as she always did. There was no other choice. In December, just before Christmas, she was called to attend Margaret of the red hair, who had conceived again, this time with a baby that was her husband's, not a foster child. Agnes felt a complicated mix of emotions as she walked to Margaret's cottage. She was happy for the woman, who clearly longed for a child of her own. But she was also anxious, remembering the stillborn boy from the previous year, hoping desperately that this birth would end differently. The labor was long and difficult. Margaret, perhaps remembering her previous loss, was tense and frightened, which made everything harder. Agnes spent hours with her, talking her through the contractions, massaging her back, encouraging her to relax and trust her body. Little Emma, now over a year old, a sturdy toddler with dark curls, was being watched by a neighbor, and Agnes was grateful for that. It would have been too much for Margaret to labor, with her foster daughter crying in the background. As dawn broke on the winter morning, Margaret finally delivered a baby girl. The infant emerged blue and silent, and for a terrible moment Agnes thought history was repeating itself. But then the baby gasped and let out a strong, indignant wail, and Margaret burst into tears of relief and joy. Agnes wrapped the baby and placed her in Margaret's arms, watching as the woman stared down at her daughter with an expression of wonder and fierce love. "She's alive," Margaret whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Agnes, she's alive." "She is," Agnes confirmed, feeling her own eyes sting with tears. "And she's strong and healthy. What will you name her?" "Agnes," Margaret said immediately, looking up at the midwife with shining eyes. "If you'll permit it, I want to name her Agnes after you. You saved little Emma's life, and you've helped me through this. I want my daughter to carry your name." Agnes felt something break open in her chest, some hard knot of fear and pain and loneliness that had been there for so long she had almost forgotten it was not a normal part of her being. She reached out and gently touched the baby's soft cheek, this new little Agnes who would carry her name into the future. "I would be honored," she said quietly. "Truly honored." After the birth, as Agnes walked home through the snow, she found herself thinking about legacy. She had no children of her own, no family to carry on her name or remember her after she died. But she had delivered hundreds of babies and had helped bring new life into the world over and over again. She had saved some, lost others, fought for all of them with everything she had. And now there was a child, a living, breathing child, who would carry her name. It was not the same as having her own daughter, but it was something. It was a mark she had left on the world, a sign that she had existed and mattered and made a difference. The year turned from 1347 to 1348, and life in the village continued its familiar rhythms. Babies were born and people died. Crops were planted and harvested. The manor lord collected his rents, and the priest collected his tithes, and the villagers scraped by as they always had, surviving through a combination of hard work, luck, and sheer stubborn determination. Agnes continued her work as midwife, though she remained cautious about drawing too much attention to herself. The gossip about Catherine's death slowly faded, replaced by newer scandals and concerns. People's memories were short. Agnes had learned, and as long as she kept delivering babies successfully and did not do anything too dramatic or unusual, most villagers were willing to overlook their previous suspicions. In the spring of 1348, strange rumors began to reach the village. Travelers spoke of a terrible plague sweeping through distant lands, Italy, France, parts of Germany. They said whole cities were dying, that the dead were piled in the streets because there were not enough living to bury them. They said it was God's judgment on a sinful world, or a curse sent by infidels, or a corruption in the air itself. The stories seemed too terrible to be true, too enormous to be real. But by summer, the plague was in England. By autumn, it had reached their region, and then it was in their village, and nothing would ever be the same again. The first victim was a traveler who had stopped in the village to rest, begging shelter at the manor house. He had been allowed to sleep in the barn, and by morning he was dead, his body covered in black swellings and bruises. Within days, the bailiff's servants who had interacted with the traveler began falling ill. Within weeks, a third of the village was sick. Agnes had never seen anything like it. The illness came on suddenly, with fever and chills and terrible swellings in the neck, armpits, and groin. The swellings, buboes, people called them, were agonizingly painful and often burst, oozing pus and blood. Most people died within 3 to 5 days of showing symptoms. A few recovered, but most did not, and the disease seemed to spread through some invisible miasma, touching this person but not that one, destroying entire families while leaving their neighbors untouched. As a midwife and healer, Agnes found herself called upon constantly, not to deliver babies, for pregnant women were particularly vulnerable to the plague, but to tend the sick and dying. She went from house to house, bringing what comfort she could, though she knew there was no cure. She held the hands of feverish children, wiped the brows of delirious adults, prayed over the dying, and helped lay out the dead. She saw things during those terrible months that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Entire families dead in their beds, children orphaned overnight, bodies left unburied because there was no one left strong enough to dig graves. She waited for the plague to strike her down as well. She knew she had been exposed to it countless times, breathing the air of sick rooms, touching fevered bodies, washing corpses. Logically, she should be dead, but day after day, week after week, she remained healthy. Perhaps she had some natural resistance to the disease. Perhaps she was simply lucky. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that sometimes came to her in dark moments, God or fate was keeping her alive because there was still work for her to do. Margaret of the red hair died in October, along with her husband and their baby daughter, the little Agnes who had been named after the midwife. Only foster daughter Emma survived, now a sturdy 2-year-old who seemed somehow immune to the plague. Peter Alcock, Emma's father, had died 2 weeks before Margaret. The little girl was orphaned, with no one to care for her. Agnes took her in without hesitation. She had no legal claim to the child, but in the chaos of the plague, no one questioned her right to do so. Emma moved into Agnes's cottage, sleeping on a pallet by the fire, and Agnes found herself, at age 35, suddenly responsible for raising a child after all these years of believing she would never be a mother. By the time winter came, more than half the village was dead. The church bells, which had tolled constantly during the worst months of the plague, now rang only occasionally. There were not enough people left to maintain the old rhythms of life. Fields lay unharvested because there were no hands to bring in the grain. Cottages stood empty, their doors hanging open, their hearths cold. The manor lord himself had fled to a distant estate, and the bailiff Edmund, whose son Agnes had saved 2 years ago, was among the dead. Agnes moved through this transformed world like a ghost among ghosts, caring for Emma and continuing to help where she could. The births had slowed dramatically. Many women had miscarried during the plague, their bodies too stressed to maintain pregnancies. Others had died before they could deliver, but there were still occasional births, still women who needed her help, and Agnes gave it as she always had. In December, as snow began to fall again, Agnes delivered what would prove to be one of her final births. The woman was Isabel, Robert of Oakwood's wife, the same Isabel whose life Agnes had saved 2 years earlier by sacrificing her trapped baby. Isabel had recovered from that terrible birth and had, against all odds, conceived again. She had survived the plague, and now, at 40 years old, she was laboring to bring another child into the world. Agnes came to her with trepidation, remembering the last time, the knife in her hand, the terrible choice she had made. But this birth was different. It was slow and painful. Isabel's body had been damaged by the previous trauma, and Agnes could tell she was struggling. But the baby was positioned correctly, and Isabel, though exhausted, was determined. "I will not die like Catherine," Isabel said through gritted teeth during a contraction. "I have survived too much to die now. This baby will live, and so will I." And somehow, through sheer force of will and Agnes's skilled hands, that is exactly what happened. Isabel delivered a daughter just as dawn broke on a cold December morning. The baby was small but healthy, her cry strong and clear in the quiet cottage. Robert wept when Agnes placed his daughter in his arms, tears of relief and joy and grief for all that had been lost, for the son who had died and the wife who had nearly died, and the terrible year they had all endured. "Thank you," he said to Agnes, his voice rough. "Thank you for everything. For saving Isabel before, and for being here now. You are a miracle worker." But Agnes shook her head. "I am not a miracle worker. I am just a midwife. I do what I can, and I trust in God and luck and the strength of the women I serve." Isabel saved herself, Robert. She fought to live, and her body found a way. As Agnes walked home through the snow, little Emma waited for her with the neighbor who had been watching her. She found herself thinking about the past year. The plague had taken so much. Margaret and baby Agnes, Peter Alcock, Marjorie Smith and Alice Cooper, who had accused her of witchcraft, Father Benedict, Joan Miller and her daughter, young Sarah, who had brought baby Emma to her that terrible morning 2 years ago. So many dead, so much loss, the entire fabric of village life torn apart. But life continued. Isabel had delivered a healthy daughter. Emma was thriving in Agnes's care, learning to speak in full sentences, following Agnes around the cottage and asking endless questions. And Agnes herself was still here, still working, still fighting for every baby and every mother who came under her care. She thought about all the births she had attended over her 18 years as a midwife. Hundreds of them, each one different, each one carrying its own weight of fear and hope. She thought about the Bobbies who had lived, healthy infants who had grown into children and would someday be adults with their own stories. She thought about the Bobbies who had died and the mothers who had died, and she mourned them all. But she also thought about the victories, small and large. Emma Alcock, who had survived against the odds and was now chattering away in Agnes's cottage, a living reminder that even in the darkest moments, life found a way. Baby Edmund, the bailiff's son who had lived, though his father had not survived the plague. Isabel's new daughter, born to a woman who should have died but had fought to live. Little Agnes, who had lived for months carrying the midwife's name, a brief, bright flame of life in a dark world. Agnes had no illusions about her work. She knew she was not a saint or a hero. She was simply a woman who had learned a trade, who had spent years observing and practicing and trying to preserve life wherever possible. She had made mistakes and experienced failures. She had lost more patients than she had saved, if she was honest about the numbers. Medieval childbirth was dangerous, and no amount of skill could change that fundamental reality. But she had tried, every single time she tried. She had shown up in the middle of frozen nights, had knelt on cold floors, had worked until her hands cramped and her back screamed in protest. She had held frightened women's hands and whispered encouragement. She had refused to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. She had stood between life and death, over and over again, and she had fought for life with everything she had. That evening, as she sat by her fire with Emma curled up beside her, Agnes allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The cottage was warm, or as warm as it ever got in winter, and there was bread and weak ale for supper. Emma was healthy and safe. Outside, the snow fell gently, covering the ravaged village in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new again. Agnes knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be more births, more illnesses, more deaths. The village would slowly rebuild, or it would fade away entirely. Life would continue its harsh, unforgiving march forward. But tonight, just for this moment, there was warmth and bread and a child's sleepy breathing, and that was enough. She thought of old Goddess, who had taught her this trade so many years ago. She thought of her mother, who had died bringing a baby into the world. She thought of all the women who had come before her, passing down their knowledge through generations, learning what worked and what didn't through painful trial and error. And she thought of the women who would come after her, who would continue this work when she was gone. For Agnes knew, with the certainty that comes from long experience, that there would always be Bobbies being born in cold hovels, always women laboring in difficult circumstances, always a need for skilled hands and compassionate hearts. The world was hard and life was fragile, but humanity endured. Women would continue to give birth, and other women would continue to help them, and that ancient partnership would persist long after Agnes herself was dust. Emma stirred in her sleep, and Agnes gently stroked the child's dark curls. This little girl, born during one of the hardest winters in memory, orphaned by plague, carried within her a story of survival that would be passed down through whatever family she eventually joined. She was a living testament to the power of human resilience, to the stubborn refusal to surrender even when everything seemed lost. And Agnes, the midwife who had delivered her and then raised her, had played her small part in that story. It was not a grand legacy, not the kind that would be recorded in chronicles or remembered by history, but it was real and it mattered and it was enough. As the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, Agnes closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest. Tomorrow would come with its demands and challenges, but tonight there was peace. Tonight, in a small cottage at the edge of a plague-ravaged village, a woman and child slept warm and safe, and that simple fact was its own quiet miracle. The hands that had welcomed so much life into the world, cracked and scarred, aged beyond their years, finally relaxed, and Agnes of Thornbury, midwife, dreamed of spring. And so we leave Agnes here, in this moment of hard-won peace. The medieval world was brutal and unforgiving, a place where life was measured out in harvests and winters, where death was always close at hand. But it was also a world where ordinary people performed extraordinary acts of courage every single day, not because they expected recognition or reward, but simply because it was what needed to be done. Agnes represented countless real women throughout medieval history, midwives who worked in impossible conditions, who fought for mothers and bobbies with limited tools and knowledge, who preserved and passed down wisdom through generations. Most of their names are lost to history, their stories unrecorded, but their legacy lives in every birth attended with skill and compassion, in every life saved through knowledge hard-won and freely shared. Sleep now, dear listener, and remember that even in the darkest times, there have always been those who chose to stand for life, who refused to give up hope, who offered their hands in service to others. May you rest well, knowing that the human capacity for courage and compassion has endured through centuries of hardship, and that the legacy of women like Agnes continues in the skilled hands of every caregiver, every healer, every person who chooses to help rather than turn away. Good